Welcome to The Explainer. Imagine this for a second. An entirely massive, widespread anti-colonial protest movement suddenly shifts gears. They step off the streets and walk straight into the actual halls of government. Today, we're diving into a really profound 28-month period starting back in 1937. This is when the Indian National Congress transitioned into an active governing body in the provinces under British rule. It was a massive, high-stakes test, and its ripples pretty much changed everything.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the governing experiment, restoring civil liberties, balancing the economy, social welfare reforms, the final verdict, and lastly, an abrupt end.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the governing experiment. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this political shift, we have to look at the geographical spread. We aren't just talking about one or two token regions here. Congress Ministries were formed in Bombay, Madras, the Central Provinces, Odisha, the United Provinces, Bihar, and they later expanded out into the Northwest Frontier Province and Assam. When this happened, it triggered just an explosion of public enthusiasm. Think about it. For years, all this mass energy had been totally suppressed by the colonial state. Suddenly, that energy is released. People were actually seeing their own leaders holding the reins of local power.
But stepping into power wasn't just an administrative challenge. It came with a deep philosophical test. Mahatma Gandhi offered some pretty fundamental advice to these newly minted officials, which basically set the ground rules for this whole high-stakes experiment. He told them to, quote, hold these offices lightly and not tightly. Prove that the Congress could rule with least assistance from the police and the army. It's a brilliant parameter, really. He was asking them to prove that an anti-colonial movement could actually govern through moral authority and public support instead of just relying on the coercive tools of the colonial state, like the police or the military.
Moving on to Section 2, restoring civil liberties.
Once they actually had the keys to power, the Congress Ministries didn't waste a single second. They immediately set to work reversing years of oppressive colonial policy, and they systematically dismantled that previous state of suppression with just a rapid-fire release of civil liberties. They repealed sweeping emergency power laws. They completely lifted press restrictions and took newspapers off government blacklists, so the free flow of information was back. They also actively curbed police powers. And this is wild. This meant a lot of former political prisoners were now essentially the bosses of the very intelligence departments that used to shadow them. They opened the jail doors, releasing political prisoners and revolutionaries, and totally revoked deportation and internment orders. Literally overnight, the entire atmosphere shifted from surveillance to freedom.
And they didn't just stop at removing bad laws. They went into full repair mode, taking specific actions to heal past wounds. Bans on organizations like the Hindustan Sevadol and various youth leagues lifted. Confiscated arms and arms licenses were restored. In Bombay, lands that had actually been confiscated by the government during the civil disobedience movement were handed straight back to their rightful owners. They even reinstated the pensions of officials who had been penalized for associating with the movement. They were basically making the people whole again.
Section 3. Balancing the economy.
Moving from a protest movement to an actual government comes with a pretty harsh reality check. The Congress Ministries found out very quickly that they simply could not undertake a complete, overnight overhaul of the agrarian structure. For example, completely abolishing the zamindari, which was the existing landlord system, was just out of their immediate reach. They were heavily constrained by the constitutional and administrative frameworks they were forced to operate inside of. It's a perfect example of the real friction between revolutionary ideals and the slow, grinding machinery of actual state governance.
This delicate balancing act totally bled into the industrial sector, too. Their attitude towards labor required a very careful touch. The basic goal was to advance the interests of the workers, sure, but while simultaneously promoting industrial peace. So, to pull that off, they rolled out a highly structured approach. First, they established conciliation machinery to mediate between labor and capital. Second, they advocated for compulsory arbitration before anyone could go on strike. And third, through all this mediation, they actively worked to secure wage increases and better conditions for workers, all while trying to keep the frequency of strikes as low as possible.
Which brings us to Section 4, social welfare reforms.
Beyond the economy, they launched this absolutely massive wave of social welfare efforts. It really showed an incredibly broad approach to nation building. For marginalized groups, specifically the historically oppressed castes referred to as Harijans, they aggressively pushed for temple entry, opened up public facilities, provided scholarships, and consciously boosted their representation in government service and the police. Over in health and education, heavy attention was directed toward primary, technical, and higher education, along with some really vital upgrades to public health and sanitation. And in the industrial sector, they didn't just look at big factories.
They gave subsidies to encourage khadi, which is hand-spun cloth, and provided strong support for indigenous enterprises to build up local economic resilience.
They also tackled some other really major societal reforms. A huge one was prohibition, which meant imposing bans on alcohol in certain designated areas. And this wasn't just some legal maneuver, it was a key part of a much wider push for societal reform and public health improvement. Alongside all that, they recognized the desperate need for humane treatment within the justice system and actively got to work on necessary prison reforms.
To really grasp how insanely fast all of this happened, just look at the timeline. 1937, the ministries are formed, and bam, they get to work. But by 1938, they're already looking way down the road. That year, they established the National Planning Committee, set up under the Congress president at the time, Subhash Chandra Bose. This really highlights their incredible momentum. They weren't just putting out daily administrative fires, they were actively drawing up the structural blueprints for what a future fully independent nation was going to look like.
Let's move to Section 5, the final verdict.
Honestly, the ultimate results of this experiment were nothing short of groundbreaking. First off, the argument that Indian self-government was strictly necessary for radical social transformation, totally confirmed. You simply couldn't fix the society without actually holding the levers of the state. Furthermore, they proved that a grassroots movement could use state power to further its goals without being co-opted or corrupted by the colonial system. From a law and order standpoint, the ministries showed they could successfully control communal riots, and politically, their legitimate council work helped neutralize a lot of erstwhile hostile elements, like wealthy landlords, pulling them right into the new democratic process.
So as you can imagine, this period triggered a massive psychological shift. The prestige of the Congress dramatically increased, proving they could actually lead people and use state power for the public's benefit. But at the same exact time, the morale of the entrenched colonial bureaucracy just plummeted. The colonial administrators were looking around, realizing they were becoming obsolete. The administrative work done by Indians during this period fundamentally weakened and completely shattered the old racist myth that Indians were simply not fit to rule themselves. For the first time, people could clearly see the shape of things to come if complete independence was won.
Finally, Section 6, an abrupt end.
Then, in October of 1939, absolutely everything changed. The outbreak of the Second World War engulfed the globe. And because the British government unilaterally declared India a belligerent in the war without even consulting the Indian political leadership, the Congress Ministries took a principled stand and resigned en masse. So a massive global conflict brought an immediate, abrupt end to this highly successful period of provincial rule.
28. It is wild to think that 28 months is all the time this took. In just over 2 years, this transformative administrative work released suppressed mass energy, restored fundamental civil liberties, pushed forward sweeping social welfare, and entirely shattered the myth that Indians couldn't effectively rule. They did all of that in just 28 months.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to chew on today. Given how effectively they ran this proof of concept for self-governance, and how profoundly it changed the psychology of both the Indian public and the British bureaucracy, did this brief 28-month experiment make the eventual complete independence of India inevitable? Did it permanently alter the trajectory of history just by proving what was possible? Think about that for a while. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep exploring this fascinating era.